Okay, so this is part 2 of chapter 7, All That Silence Said. So Kensuke just started teaching the boy to be able to fish. Kensuke seemed to know every tree in the forest, where all the fruit grew, what was ripe and what was not, what was worth climbing for. He climbed impossible trees nimbly, footsure and fearless. Nothing in the forest alarmed him, not the howling gibbons swinging above his head to drive him off their fruit, not the bees that swarmed about him when he carried down their comb from a hollow high in a tree. He used the honey for sugaring and bottling fruit, and always his family of orangutans came along, shadowing us through the forest, patrolling the tracks ahead, scampering along behind. All Kensuke had to do was sing, and they'd come. They seemed almost hypnotised by the sound of his voice. They were intrigued by Stella, but they were nervous, and we were nervous. For the time being, we kept our distance from one another. One evening, quite unexpectedly, as I was watching Kensuke at his fishing, one of the young ones clambered on my lap and began to examine my nose with his finger, and then he investigated my ear. He pulled it rather harder than I'd liked, but I didn't yelp. After that, the rest followed suit, using me as if I was a climbing frame. Even the older ones, the bigger ones, would reach out and touch me from time to time, but thankfully they were always a little more reserved, more circumspect. But Stella still kept her distance from them, and they from her. In all this time, I suppose I must have been some months on the island by now. Kensuke had said very little. The little English he did speak was clearly hard for him. When words were used between us, they proved to be of little help of understanding each other, so we resorted for the most part to smiles and nods, signing and pointing. Sometimes we even drew pictures in the sand to explain ourselves. I was just about enough to get along. But there was so much that I was burning to find out. How had he come to be here all alone on the island? How long had he been here? And how had he come by all those pots and pans and tools, and the knife he always wore in his belt? How come one of his wooden chests was stuffed with sheets? Where had they come from? Where had he come from? And why was he being so kind to me now, so considerate when he had clearly resented me so much before? But whenever I ventured any such question, he would simply shake his head and turn away from me like a deaf man ashamed of his affliction. I was never quite sure whether he really did understand or not, or did he just not want to understand. Either way, I could see it made him uncomfortable, so I probed no more. Questions, it seemed, were an intrusion. I resigned myself to waiting. Our life together was always busy and regular as clockwork, up at dawn and down the track, a little way to bathe in the stream where it tumbled cold and fresh out of the hillside into a great cauldron of smooth rocks. We would wash our sheets and our clothes here too. He'd made me my own kimono by now, slapping and pounding them on the rocks before hanging them out to dry with the branch nearby. Breakfast was a thick pulpy fruit juice which seemed different every day, on bananas or coconut. I never tired of bananas, but very soon I became sick of coconut. The mornings were spent either fishing in the shallows or fruit gathering in the forest. Sometimes after a storm, we scoured the beach for more of his painting shells. Only the biggest and the flattest would do, or for Flotsam to join the stack of wood at the back of the cave. There were 2 stacks, one clearly for firewood, the other, I suppose, reserved for his woodwork. Then it was home to the cave house for a lunch of raw fish, always delicious, and usually breadfruit, always bland and difficult to swallow. A short nap after lunch for both of us, and then he would settle down at his table to paint. As I watched, he became so engrossed that the failing light of the evenings always came too soon for me. We would cook a fish soup over the fire. Everything went in, the head, tail, and a dozen different herbs. Kensuke wasted nothing, and there were always red bananas afterwards, all I could eat. I never went hungry. When supper was over, we would sit together at the mouth of the cave and watch the last of the sun drop into the sea. Then, without a word, he'd stand up. We would bow solemnly to one another, and would unroll his sleeping bag mat and leave me to mine. To see Kensuke at his work was always a wonder to me. He was so intent, so concentrated in everything he did. But watching him paint was the best of all. To begin with, he would only let me kneel beside him and watch. I could sense that this too, he liked his privacy. He did not want to be disturbed. On the table in front of him he put out 3 saucers, 1 saucer of octopus ink. For Kensuke, octopuses were not just for eating. 1 saucer of water and another for mixing. He always held his brush upright and very steady in his hand, fingers down on one side, thumb on the other. He would kneel bent over his work, his beard almost touching the shell as he was painting. I think perhaps he was a little short-sighted. I would watch him for hours on end, marvelling at the delicacy of his work and the sureness of his touch. Then one rainy afternoon, when it rained, I found he'd set out a shell for me, my own 3 saucers and my own paintbrush. He took such delight in teaching me, in my every clumsy attempt. I remember early on I tried to paint the jellyfish that had attacked me. He laughed out loud at that, but not in a mocking way, rather in recognition, in memory of what had brought us together. I had always liked to draw, but for Kensuke I learned to love it, that to draw or to paint I first had to observe well, then set out the form of the picture in my head, and send it down through my arm, through the tip of my brush, and onto the shell. He taught me all this entirely without speaking. He simply showed me. The evidence that he was so considerable craftsman was all around me. The cave house must have been entirely furnished by him, fashioned mainly from flotsam. The chest, the workbench itself, the shelves and the table. He must have made the rush matting, the bamboo panelling, everything. And on close examination I could see it was all perfectly finished. No nails, no screws, just neat doweling. He had used some form of glue where necessary, and sometimes twine as well. Ropes for tree climbing, fishing spears, fishing nets and fishing rods were stacked in one corner, though I'd never seen him use the rods. He had to have made them all. He made his own paintbrushes as well, and as soon as I wanted to find out how, Kensuke had a favourite orangutan, a large female called Tomodachi, who would often come and sit by him to be groomed. Kensuke was grooming her one day just outside the mouth of the cave house, the other orangutans looking on, when I saw him quite deliberately pluck out the longest and the darkest hairs from her back. He held them up to show me, grinning spiritually. At the time I didn't really understand what he was up to. Later I watched him at work, bench trimming the hairs with his knife, dipping them in the sap. I'd seen him tap from the tree of that same morning, cutting out a short length of hollow bamboo and then filling it with Tomodachi's hair. A day later the glue had hardened and he had a paintbrush. Kensuke seemed to have found a way to satisfy his every need. We were silent at our painting one day. The rain thundered down on the forest below, when he stopped, put down his paintbrush and said very slowly, in a very measured way, as if he'd thought about how to say it for a long time, "I teach you painting, Mika." This was the first time he'd ever called me by my name. "You teach me speak English. I won't speak English. You teach me." It was the beginning of an English lesson that would last for months. Every day, dawn to dusk, I translated the world around him into English. We did what we had always done, but now I talked all the while he would echo every word, every phrase he wanted to. His brow would furrow with effort of it. It was as if by saying each word he simply swallowed it into his brain. Once told, once practised, he would rarely forget, and if he did, he was always very annoyed with himself. Sometimes, as I enunciated a word, I would notice that his eyes would light up. He would be nodding and smiling, almost as if he recognised the word, as if he was greeting an old friend. He would repeat it again and again, savouring the sound of it before committing it to memory for good. And, of course, more words he knew, the more he tried to experiment with them. Single words became clipped phrases, and they became entire sentences. His pronunciation, though, never did improve, however hard he tried. Michael was always Mika, sometimes Mika-san. But now at last we could talk more easily to one another. The long silence in which our friendship had been forged was over. It had never been a barrier between us, but it had been limiting. We were sitting by the cave mouth one sunset, and he said, "You see now if I understand, Mika-san. You tell me story of you, where you live, why you come here my island, from baby to now. I listen." So I did. I told him about home, about my mother and father, about the brick factory closing, about football with Eddie and the Mudlarks, about the Peggy Sue and our voyage around the world, about football in Brazil and lions in Africa and spiders in Australia, about my mother being ill and about the night I fell overboard. Very good, I understand, very good, he said when I had finished. So football you like? When I little, I play football too. Very happy time. Long ago now, in Japan, in my home. He sat in silence for some moments. You very long way from home, Mika-san. You never sad sometimes, I see, so I make you happy. Tomorrow we go fishing, and maybe I tell you my story too. My story, your story, maybe same story now. The sun had suddenly gone. We stood up and bowed to one another. Oyasumi Masai, he said. Good night, I said. It was only the time of day he spoke Japanese, though he did sing in Japanese, mostly. I had taught him 10 green bottles, which always made him laugh when he sang it. I loved his laugh. It was never loud, more a prolonged chuckle, but it always warmed my heart. The next morning he picked up 2 of his fishing rods and a net and led it away into the forest. Today we catch big fish, Mika, not small fish, he announced. He was taking us to part of the island where I had been washed up all the months before, but rarely had cause to visit since, because there was little or no fruit to be found there. We had to be a difficult path through the forest before joining a cliff path that wound its way down to a hidden sandy bay. As we emerged from the forest onto the beach, Stella ran off, bounding once into the shallows, barking at me to play with her. Suddenly Kensuke caught me by the arm. You look, Mika-san, what you see. His eyes were full of mischief. I didn't know what I was supposed to be looking for. Nothing here, yes? I very clever fellow. You watch, I show you. He made out for the end of the beach, and I followed. Once there, he began to pull and tug at the undergrowth. To my surprise, it simply came away in his hands. I saw first what looked like a log lying in the sand, but then he dragged away more branches. I saw it was part of a boat, an outrigger, a long, wide dugout with a frame and outriggers on either side. It was covered in canvas, which he folded back very slowly, chuckling to himself as he did so. And there, lying in the bottom of the boat beside a long oar, was my football. He reached in and tossed it to me. It was softer now, and much of the white leather was cracked and discoloured, but in places I could still just make out Eddie's name. And there's the boat that they have just dug up, that Kensuke's obviously had all along on his island. So how do you think he's feeling? Because he's now been able to communicate better with Kensuke, and Kensuke's been able to communicate with him, and he's just found his football. What do you think they're going to do on the boat? Chapter 8's coming up, and it's called Everyone Dead in Nagasaki.